One of the very first sessions that I had in Taiwan was in the National Parliament building, and that's called the Legislative Yuan in Taiwan. We were scheduled to meet with the head of social services. Unfortunately, she was called away at the last minute, so she sent along her chief of staff, the chief of staff for the Minister of Social Policy, and that was Mr. Zhou that met us. So Mr. Zhou explained the history of social care in Taiwan, and he went on to discuss some of the contemporary challenges. So he told us that the first social care policy in Taiwan was enacted in 1995, and that was alongside the introduction of a national health insurance scheme. The second iteration, that was the Long-Term Care Act, was launched in 2018. So it was consultations prior to that, and the policy was launched in 2018. And he explained that had a very clear focus on people that were over the age of 65. So older people struggling to live independently. Version 3 of the Act is scheduled to be introduced in 2027. And already Mr. Zhou is predicting that this will try to have more of a focus on taking a preventative approach, perhaps increasing the options for people, and that certainly means increasing the number of institutions that Taiwan has. And he suspects that it may start to refer to people having individual insurance rather than it being fully covered by the state. So through our discussion with Mr. Zhou, I found that Taiwan is really quite similar to Scotland in that the national government sets the strategy and allocates the budgets, and local government then either provides directly or commissions other organisations to provide services and supports throughout the towns, cities and rural areas. As in Scotland, the first step in the social care process is an assessment. Now, the assessment in Taiwan considers, firstly, the role of the family, secondly, the role of social services, and then finally, whether any costs may be payable by the individual for any services that might be required. Now, unlike in Scotland, after someone requests an assessment, that assessment is organised and takes place within 3 days. If the government is liable for any costs, which is likely, then the money is released within a further 3 days. The whole process is digital, and there's a clear division of responsibility between the statutory worker undertaking the assessment and then the worker planning what to do next to meet the person's requirements. At another point in my trip, I visited the Taiwan Association of Family Carers, and they explained to me that there has been a 20-fold increase in long-term care funding since 2018. So a huge increase in the last 6 years or so in the amount of money the government is spending on long-term care. But despite that, the association explained to me that the cultural expectation remains that care and support is a family responsibility. Now, of course, I was very interested in probing that and exploring that. Culture is a dynamic thing. Is that culture still the same today as it was in the past? I wanted to ask about to what degree culture is perhaps being westernised or individualised. And the society did acknowledge that some opinions, some expectations are changing. And that was curious. But they were also very clear that 6 days was an unacceptable length of time to wait. That the government had an obligation to make that a shorter timescale. Now, I think for anyone listening to this, if you want to think about Scotland and the assessment process and how quickly funds might be released or how quickly services might start, 6 days sounds quite good to me. Other conversations with people working in the system exposed some other features that I found curious, I found interesting or noteworthy. So many people feel that they have to retell their story too often to different so-called experts. I think we can relate to that a lot in Scotland. Some people thought the system is very institution-centred rather than person-centred. So most commonly, people will be offered access to a service centre in the community. A service centre is very like a day centre. It might well have administrative offices attached, but it is an institution. I was also curious about what happens when people have no family. Who bears the responsibility then? And the response I was given from a few different people was that neighbours or community leaders then have the responsibility to make sure that person is okay, that they have appropriate care and support. Now, quite clearly, there'll be a nuance, there'll be a complexity to all of this, but it was absolutely fascinating for me to explore the system, both hearing from Mr. Joe directly about the intent, and then hearing from people involved in accessing social care or providing social care. It was very, very interesting. Back to the Legislative Yuan and Mr. Joe, he was keen to tell us about some of the main challenges, as he saw it, that were facing the politicians and facing the national government with the long-term care system. So Mr. Joe was clear that currently older people are the highest priority in the social care system, and they have the simplest pathway to accessing support. So he explained the greatest challenge facing the government is to extend social care supports to adults and to younger people, and then to make sure that those supports are integrated across the lifespan. The way he saw it, different parts of the system are quite disconnected as you move from being a younger person to an adult, to an older adult, and then to an older person. He felt that was quite disconnected. The second challenge that he explained is to increase the amount of support available to people in their own home. Now, he saw that particularly through adaptations to the person's home, or technologies that might improve the person's experience in their home. He certainly did not see that as increasing support that might be available in the person's home. It was quite clear the strategy for the government is to increase the number of institutions that are available for people to access. Mr. Joe saw increasing people's ability to live independently through adaptations and technology as a cost-efficient way of extending the service. Quite often he talked about money and his concern about how much the system would cost. Thirdly, the final challenge that Mr. Joe identified was the increasing demand for care homes and for access to institutions in the community. And he described Taiwan as having a super-aging society. And certainly if we look at the statistics, we can see that Taiwan is aging at a far faster rate than almost any other country in the world. I was absolutely bursting to ask Mr. Joe dozens and dozens of questions and follow-up questions and to understand the system more. Unfortunately, our time with him was limited, and I wasn't able to dig into as much of the system as I would have liked. That was certainly a pattern throughout my time in Taiwan. I had so many questions that I wanted to explore, and time was so tight, our programme was so busy. But after my time with Mr. Joe at the Legislative Yuan in the National Parliament building, I felt I had a small amount of insight and a huge amount of curiosity to know more about the Taiwanese system and about the advantages and the challenges that it faces. I also had the opportunity, just a day or two after seeing Mr. Joe in the Legislative Yuan, to visit the Ministry of Health and Welfare, so another department of central government. And when I was there, they had prepared a number of presentations on different topics for the 6 participants to hear. So they spoke about prevention of domestic violence in Taiwan, the incorporation of the UN rights of the child into routine operations, and the use of the clubhouse model to support people with poor mental health in their communities.